Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the Disclosure Podcast. I am your host, Ed, and on this week's podcast, this has kind of been a long time coming in many ways, but I'm joined on the podcast by Matt, who is an ex-Livestock Haulier. And me and Matt, Matt and I should say, we kind of made contact probably about a year ago, quite a while ago now. And Matt had reached out saying that he wanted to have a discussion with me about kind of some things he's done, but also about animal agriculture in general. And even though he'd been involved in the industry and was no longer doing that side of things anymore, there was still some things that maybe we could disagree on, even though we probably have a lot in common. And so I say it's taken a little while to get to this point, but I'm really happy to say that Matt's joining me on the podcast today. And I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion about some things that I've never really spoken about before in terms of the transportation of animals, but also I think into a wider discussion of exploitation of animals. And I know Matt's spoken with a lot of really influential and interesting people within the vegan movement, and has obviously met and spoken to a lot of people outside of the movement as well. And so I think the conversation today will have a really interesting tone to it, and I think we will learn a lot, hopefully, from each other. I know I'm going to learn a lot from Matt, and hopefully, I can reciprocate that learning as well. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you as well. Yeah, glad to be here.
Great. And so I guess the best place to start really is perhaps you could just kind of give us an overview and tell us, what it was like being a livestock haulier, what got you to that point, and I guess then we can maybe bring it on to where you are now and the feelings you have now.
Yeah, sure. So back in 2012, me and my brother started truck driving together. They call it team driving. Basically, you and another person, another driver, you basically live in the truck together. One person drives and the other person sleeps, and vice versa. And we just drove all across America. We were away from home for either weeks or even months at a time, right?
Right.
And we did that for 4 years, and it was quite an experience. And then kind of long story short, but me, my girlfriend and I at the time, she's my fiance now. We're going to be married soon, which is exciting.
That's nice. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Well, she became pregnant, right? And at that time, I was only home. I was getting home on the weekends, right? And that just didn't feel like enough. I'm about to be a father. And it just seemed like, no judgment. There's a lot of truck drivers out there, and they kind of do what they got to do. But for me personally, I was like, I need to be home more than just on the weekends if I'm going to be any kind of a present and good father. So I started looking for truck driving jobs that would offer that to me, that would get me home every night. And I found this company that said that they can do that, and that company was, a company that primarily delivers pigs to a slaughterhouse. And actually, I told them, no, I'm not interested in that at all. I don't want to do that. And they said, that's fine. We don't just deliver pigs. We deliver other stuff, tile and furniture and stuff, and we can still get you home every night. And I said, "Oh, great!" So I got on with those guys, and that lasted about 2 weeks before they said, "Oh, guess what? This route you're doing doesn't really exist anymore. So either you got to go back to your old job, or we have pigs for you to deliver." And
wow.
Yeah, so we decided to go with the pigs, obviously. And, that's why I'm here talking to you now.
Yeah.
So, and I was there, I think total, it was less than 2 years, I think. But, so basically what happened was, I got this job, I started hauling the pigs. And also, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I listened to a lot of Joe Rogan. So... which, some of your listeners, right, and I might be triggering some people right now. But he was actually the guy who got me thinking more about factory farming, because, he would always talk about hey man, did you see that drone footage of the hog farm, and it's so crazy, he's saying all that kind of stuff. And, I'm sitting there listening like, I don't need drone footage. I have first person footage and I'm seeing what's happening, and I started kind of thinking more deeply about, how really controversial these things really are. And as I was working in such close proximity to animal suffering and thinking more deeply about, the impact on the environment and, getting into all that sort of stuff, watching documentaries like, Cowspiracy and, things like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
So, basically with this job, there's kind of two routes. I try not to get too specific, like, and we'll get more into this as to why, my philosophy on how I try to talk about these things. But, I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, and so this job had kind of two positions where it took two drivers, and they call it a slip seat um, job kind of a thing. So basically, what it is you have one starting location in Las Vegas, and then a driver will get into a truck, and he'll go up north into Utah and like get the pigs from the actual factory farm, and then come right back to the same place in Las Vegas, and then somebody else will get in the truck and deliver them and drive all the way down to East LA to the the Farmer John slaughterhouse facility.
Right. Yeah. The
Yep.
relatively infamous Farmer John's in vegan
Yep.
circles.
Yes, with all the weird murals and everything. Deliver,
Yeah.
deliver the pigs there, and then come back empty to the same spot. And then that, the first driver will and the cycle kind of repeats itself. So I've done both of those positions. I've been the driver who just picks up a load of pigs, like someone's already gone up into Utah, and I've been the driver that goes south into East LA, and I've been the driver that also goes up north, and gets the pigs. And I started the first position I had was the one that goes to the slaughterhouse, and that's when I started basically filming things. So now I've become aware. I'm listening to Joe Rogan, and I'm not sure why. I don't have a good reason why I did it. I don't think. I just something felt like, like people just don't know. They're obviously disconnected from that cellophane wrapped pork chop in the supermarket, and something, I don't know. I just wanted to do something to inform people just more about where this stuff actually comes from.
Yeah.
So I started recording. The point of me recording wasn't necessarily, I wasn't trying to capture anything necessarily anomalous or anything too crazy, I guess. My point was I was trying to capture just kind of the regular goings on, just from a truck driver's perspective, what I got to see, Although
Yeah.
one time there was some kind of sickness that happened that started at the factory farm, and everybody was showing up at the farms with like 30, even 40 dead pigs in their trailers, and I was able to kind of capture some of that. So a video I sent you, I think that was some of what I did capture.
Yeah, just for a little bit of context, Matt sent me a video about 2.5, 3 minutes long, which I guess was like a selection of a lot of the different clips that you showed, and we'll come on to it. But yeah, some of the most harrowing stuff in that is just sequences of just piles of dead pigs, I guess, just being discarded and pulled out of the trucks. And yeah, we can probably come on to that, but just provide a bit of context, and also an extra bit of context. The Farmer John slaughterhouse we referenced just a few minutes ago is where LA Animal Save or LA Pig Save is held on a weekly basis. So just so people know where we're at. But sorry, Matt, please continue.
Oh yeah, fine. Anyway, so yeah, and then I got the other position where I would drive up north into Utah, and what's interesting is the truck drivers would actually have to put on full-on hazmat, like basically suits, and you actually would get into the back of the trailer and like help kind of load the pigs in. And in the trailers, there's kind of different sections with gates, So they don't want all the pigs in one big group. I guess I'm not sure why, but I would imagine that just doesn't really work out. I guess if they're all just one mass, I guess. So they have these gates in there, and like you have to actually kind of help count the pigs, and they go in there, and then you got to close the gates, and you realize really quickly how these animals are thought of as merely a commodity. It's all, you know, in the truck driving sense. Um, just in general, you're always worried about like how much weight you have on different axles and that sort of thing. And we go through these weigh stations, and they can write you fines if you're too heavy on certain axles. Like you have limitations on like your gross weight and limitations on how much weight are on the various axles. So that's the sort of thinking you have as you're loading the pigs in these different sections. Some sections are going to be a lot tighter than other ones, just because you have a weight requirement, right? So you're not
Right.
even thinking about like how they're doing subjectively speaking. It's all very much, yeah. These things are a commodity. You got to kind of squish them in there. So that's yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's quite it's almost like an indictment of how we view, especially livestock or farmed animals, in the sense of they are just a weight. They're a weight when they're at markets, they're a weight in the supermarket, because you pay a certain price by weight. It's just they're a weight to every chain of the system, I guess. And so just for clarification, the pigs, their journey was from Utah to East LA. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
And so how many miles would that be? I mean, how long is the journey?
Oh man, I'll have. It's been a couple years, so I'm trying to remember. I can think of it probably more in terms of hours than I can figure out
Yeah,
miles.
that's okay.
Yeah, so it was maybe like 9 to 10 hours total, I think.
Yeah, it's a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a long time. And during the summertime, especially, they would, I mean, at the factory farm itself, right before you leave, you would water the pigs. They have a kind of like a sprinkler system built in the trailer. There's misters and stuff, which was actually, that's a nice feature, I would say. But it would happen only once throughout, the whole journey over there. There's
Wow.
not really stopping and watering or anything. So
And I guess during summer, you're looking at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe pushing on a little bit more even.
oh, more for sure. Yeah, it gets up to 120. Which is about 50 Celsius, I think.
Yeah, I think in England, English terms, you're looking at plus 30 Celsius, I think. It's hot, it's hotter than we could stand, and we're not in metal trucks, because these trucks they're metal, aren't they? For the most part, these big ones that you see
Yeah.
kind of in videos, and so they just the heat inside of them is even higher than it is outside the truck. Yeah, and then you've got these bodies crammed in, they're all exuding heat, they're all panting, these animals, and and then I guess if people have seen footage that has been filmed by LA Pig Save and indeed also Animal Alliance Network, who host vigils at Farmers John's, they give water to these pigs, and you see how thirsty they are because of the heat. I mean, I was in LA in May and June, I think, last year. So it wasn't even the hottest it was during that summer, but just the heat for me alone was quite unbearable, let alone for what these pigs were
Mm-hmm.
enduring as well. Yeah, it's interesting to think about that journey time. But sorry, Matt, please do carry on.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of heat, that's much more concerning. If you're worried about either the cold or the heat, when in the winter time, like we would get snow built up on the trailers, and the pigs are so hot in there, just the way they're packed in there, and their body heat, that the snow would just melt off the trailer. It's they do a lot better in terms of staying warm as opposed to trying to stay cool. So yeah, it's the heat. Actually, kind of going back to when I was on the south route, that's another thing I noticed as well, is rather than that kind of anomaly, people having all these dead pigs. Dead pigs were just that was just a very common occurrence. It was very normal just to have 1, 2, 3 dead pigs. From that journey from Utah to East LA. And I think the number was 8. If you had 8 dead pigs, that's kind of like the magic number where they're gonna, you know, I'm not sure exactly what, but somebody's gonna note it or something.
And how many pigs were in each of the trucks?
I think if I recall correctly, I think it was a maximum of, you couldn't have more than 200, and it was always around that many, depending, because the pigs would have an average weight, and so depending what the average weight was would change how many pigs were in there. But it was usually 150, somewhere around there.
And I guess there's a lot of pigs for a truck. I guess it just emphasizes how kind of crammed in they are, and how backed up they are inside the trucks. And so you say you stopped doing this about 2 years ago or so. Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that was, so I'm interested to go back to when you started filming, I guess, and that kind of, you listened to Joe Rogan, and and I guess it's quite interesting because a lot of vegans don't like Joe Rogan, and there is understandable reasons why.
Yeah.
But he does talk a lot about what happens in animal agriculture, and he's actually, for instance, he's outspoken against things like ag-gag laws, and laws that kind of restrict freedom to show what happens in these facilities. I'm kind of quite happy, but also not that surprised to hear that Joe Rogan almost piqued that interest in you to think differently, maybe about something that you kind of just accepted as being potentially a job. And another thing I want to emphasize is what you said right at the beginning about how you wanted this, you didn't necessarily want to be hauling pigs, that wasn't the purpose, but out of the situation, the environment you were in, your lifestyle of your family, it was something that you just kind of like stumbled into out of, I guess, more of a necessity than anything else. And so I think that's an interesting point to consider, that sometimes we as vegans, if you go to vigils or you see drivers, the first thing you think of is, well, how can these people do that? What sort of person could drive animals to their deaths? But actually, it's not fair to not look beyond just the surface level of what someone's doing, and to try and understand the environmental and economical factors that drive people to do something that realistically most people wouldn't want to do if they had the luxury of choice. And so I realized that was what you touched on at the beginning, because I think it's very pertinent and something that needs to be emphasized as well. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And I definitely want to kind of talk about that after I wrap up this little. I have one more thing, but yeah, the idea of being disconnected, for sure. But yeah, so I started documenting, and I started giving my footage to, it wasn't PETA, but it was another organization called Farm USA, I think. Farm, it's an acronym. Yeah, Farm Animal Rights Association or something, or movement. Yeah.
Yeah, I think movement is the one. Yeah.
Yeah, movement. Yeah, and through them, I was contacted by director Shaun Monson, who's directed Earthlings, and I think another one, Unity. He probably has more.
Yeah, Unity.
Yep. And he wanted to work with me a little bit, and basically that led to the experience of I had celebrity and serious vegan Joaquin Phoenix join me for the day. This is where things start kind of ramping up, and it gets a little more dicey, because I essentially snuck him into the factory farm, and we captured the whole thing on film and GoPros and everything, and he was able to experience the factory farm for himself. He climbed in the back of the trailer with me. He had the hazmat suit on, and he was right. The pigs were right there with us, and it was so interesting to see kind of his reaction and his experience with it, and how much it affected him, and it kind of made me wonder a little bit, why am I not having the same type of experience that he's having? I'm certainly having an experience, but at the same time, maybe not as much as he is. So
Could you
Yeah.
describe the experience Joaquin was having?
Well, he was, I mean, very emotional and very kind of, bothered by the whole thing, you know.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
it was just it was a lot. It was a lot for him, for sure.
it's kind of, I guess it must have been almost a surreal moment for you to go, hang on a minute, that's Hollywood A-list actor Joaquin Phoenix in the back of this pig truck with me, in a hazmat suit. You know, how on earth did this happen? That must have been quite an unusual thing for you, and I guess maybe you felt the expectation to try and be on the same emotional level that he was at, and I think that I can imagine that must have been slightly jarring for you to be like, hang on a minute, this is, this big, Hollywood actor, he's in Gladiator and lots of really amazing films, and then here he is having this reaction. Yeah, how can you describe that? Maybe just of being there with him and
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of, yeah, if you could maybe go into a bit more detail about what just that experience was like for you. Then, if you weren't necessarily feeling the emotional, the same intensity of emotions as Joaquin, what was going through your mind, and how were you feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I was basically just trying not to do like the gladiator thumbs down thing the whole time, you know. Yeah, I mean, personally, I do try. I don't like fan out too hard, maybe, or I think a lot of us are that way, where you do try to remember, like, yeah, celebrities are people, obviously. But I was way excited. Like, he is one of my favorite actors. Just Walk the Line, Gladiator, Her, like, these are just such amazing films, and so
Right.
yeah, that was really cool. But yeah, it was, yeah, it was certainly on my mind, definitely.
I can imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so that I had that experience, and then afterwards, you know, uh, it was kind of like what do I do now? Like, I'm still here, stuck in this awkward position of not liking factory farming, but, like, what do I do about it? Like, what's the answer to that? So I'm kind of left with a lot of feelings. One of those feelings is, I would say, anxiety. There's some anxiety in there because of what I've done, because of the work I've done with animal rights activists, and the filming and Joaquin Phoenix and all of that. That makes me nervous, because what if the company finds out, and this is a Utah-based company, and they are known for really using their ag-gag laws, and what if I'm facing some kind of litigation or so on and so forth. So, there's some anxiety in there. I also, another feeling is, like, embarrassed, because I still find myself at the end of a long and complicated industrialized, like, food chain. As I learned from the author Michael Pollan, I think his book Omnivore's Dilemma. He writes in a lot of detail, just kind of about different food chains, right?
Right.
And um, he basically writes about how the modern industrial one is problematic for all sorts of reasons. And basically what I'm saying is my dietary behavior hasn't really changed, right? And so, despite the fact that I'm doing all of this journalism and all of this, the proximity that I worked, such close proximity to animal suffering, and yet in my freezer, I still have bacon in there. What's that about? I don't know. I think another feeling is maybe confusion, because as I look out into the world, especially through the lens of social media, and I'm trying to answer the question, what do I do about this? Yeah, it's very polarized, very a lot of people are saying a lot of different things. There's whether it's a documentary, whether it's YouTube response videos, it's we can't seem to agree about what to do about it. Even if we recognize the same problems, there's the is and the ought, and on the ought side, we're there's a lot of people saying different things. And those are all kind of negative feelings, but for a positive feeling, I do feel excited though. I feel excited for change. It's if you can kind of maybe zoom out a little bit. I think there's a way to look at it where you don't have to let it get you down so much, but you can be excited that things are changing, and you can be a part of that.
It's empowering, I think, to feel that. I think for so many of us in life, we feel kind of helpless to these big industries and feel like that maybe we can't have that much of an actual impact on them, so to speak. And so, I think that feeling of like I can be a part of something that is progressive and does change something that I feel that is wrong and immoral I think that's an empowering act. So I can imagine that kind of let's call it the post-Joaquin phase, so to speak. There must have been a whole host of different emotions, fear, anxiety, kind of, and I guess that reinforcement of the disconnect, as you say, there's bacon in my freezer. But I guess on a similar level, I mean, I'd seen slaughterhouse footage and graphic footage and still ate animals, and Earthlings pushed me into being vegan, but I would be being disingenuous if I said that I hadn't seen an animal being killed in a slaughterhouse. So I feel like a lot of us, sometimes it takes extra exposure to get to that point, and sometimes I think that we have this expectation that you see something wrong in the world and then you just change immediately to try and counteract that wrong. But there's so many examples of things that we know are wrong, but we still kind of consciously or even unconsciously still do these things because for whatever reason we haven't quite connected with the true brutality of what it is that we're witnessing. So I think then there are different areas where what you're saying can kind of translate into the everyday consumer's experience. And so I think it's interesting to say that you still had bacon in your freezer, and even though you'd been in this moment and you filmed some horrible things and you'd seen some horrible things, and on many levels you were recognizing and feeling that to you that was wrong. I think it's almost like a stage of progression that most of us, I think, go through. That recognition, this is wrong, but I'm still partaking in it. And then you start to think, hang on a second, okay, now I need to start changing myself. That repetition of the same imagery, of the same, job, so to speak, just constant repetition until it reaffirms itself within you is that you need to change. It's an interesting moral dilemma, I guess, would be the phrasing, isn't it?
Yeah. What are your thoughts about what disconnects us from our diet? Is to me, I mean, convenience is a huge one, I think.
Yeah, I think there's this habit of we all have one. There's 101 different excuses that people use to try and not be vegan, but I think the ones it boils down to are taste, convenience, culture, and tradition. We love the taste. It's a thing that for most of us, we've done for decades. It's convenient because we know what we can buy. Supermarkets and shops are full of these products, and we can say that veganism's growing and there's an abundance of vegan options, and that's true. But if you compare it to the abundance of non-vegan options, it's still very small. And so convenience is a big player, especially if you don't live in somewhere like LA or London, where I live. If you get out into these smaller, let's say, small town America or Little England, as we say over here, then it becomes quite hard. And yes, you have fruits and vegetables and all the essentials, but it's almost disingenuous because my diet's full of different vegan products like vegan ice creams and vegan cheeses and vegan meats. So it would be kind of me wagging the finger going, you have to live off these bare essentials that you can get, but I'm going to enjoy the luxuries. So convenience is a big player. And I think culture, social culture, if your friends aren't doing it or your family aren't doing it, then there's that pressure. You don't want to be outcast. As humans, we've evolved from kind of community tribal beings, and so being a part of a community is where we feel safe, and fear of being ostracized is potentially the worst punishment of all. And going vegan, you're almost implementing that fear of being ostracized from your social groups by not conforming to what everyone else wants from you to do. And so I think that plays a big part in traditions, Christmas, Thanksgiving, these big holidays and these big ceremonies and celebrations. The idea of, I can't partake in a holiday or in an activity that I really enjoy. I mean, of course, you can celebrate all these things and be vegan, but that's a process to realize. And for me, I think those are the four biggest reasons. I just, it's almost like that bandwagon effect. If most people around you are doing something, you don't want to be the odd one out who raises your hand and says, "Hey, everyone, I think this is wrong," because it just feels unnatural to do that. You want to feel safe in the herd, so to speak. And what do you think? What would you say? Convenience. Are there any other things that you think hold people back from recognizing that necessity to change earlier?
I do. I certainly do. And I think that, so ideas like convenience and what was the other one you said?
Culture.
Yeah, convenience and culture. Those things, I think they can feel a little bit intangible and maybe not just a little more conceptual. Something that's something else that disconnects us is obviously things like ag laws and factory farms being secretive. Like causing people to do, this hidden camera style journalism, right? That's
Yeah,
what
right.
I think that's a big part of it as well. Just the industry. That's another thing as well is there's a way to look at it where you're like, yo, what's up with these industries? Why are they being so secretive? Like, what's going on there? And there's another way to look at it where it's like, well, these corporations and in the industries are just protecting themselves. They're protecting their business.
Yeah.
Doesn't make it right, obviously, but
No, but there is that interesting. It's interesting that we hold these industries like farms and slaughterhouses. We think they should be held to a higher accountable level, and I guess the reason we think that is because there is, what we'd perceive to be immoral, but what most people, consumers, would perceive to be having the potential of being immoral. So illegal activity, I guess is what I'm alluding to, and so we think that they should be held to a higher level of scrutiny. But I think ag laws are definitely unconstitutional and should be ruled out. And I think as citizens we have that moral obligation to shine a light on industries that refuse to be honest and be true.
yeah,
And I think you're probably right that part of that is that part of the problem with people changing is these industries are very deceitful and they do lie and they have marketing campaigns and they pump millions of dollars into tricking someone or the consumer into believing something that isn't true. I think that's probably a very very obvious point.
yeah, definitely. So what do you think about, I guess, the state of our nutrition science? Like what comes to mind?
That's an interesting question. That's a tricky one, isn't it? I guess convoluted, confusing. I think I saw. Actually, I was looking at. I think it was at the American Dietetic Association the other day, and it was really alarming because there's a lot of controversy about them. So for anyone listening, the ADA, I think it's renamed to something else now, is made up of 100 certified practitioners, so doctors, nutritionists, and it's the biggest in the world, I believe, and so a lot of the science that comes out of that is very highly respected. And I, as a vegan, often use the science that comes from that to illustrate, my arguments as well. But a lot of money comes from like Coca-Cola and McDonald's. And I was absolutely stunned by this, that the sort of pinnacle, the beacon of health advice, they're receiving millions of dollars from McDonald's, for goodness sake. And it's alarming. And so I think the conundrum of so many people is there's so much contradictory science that comes out, and there's funders from different places and from different backgrounds with different agendas that it's really hard sometimes to just find what's objectively true. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up because normally, immediately people they just start talking about what the health,
Oh, right.
the documentary made by the same guys who made Cowspiracy, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's a big part of it's a lot of what I've been learning about and looking into, because it seems to be where the fire is burning hottest right now in terms of the factory farm or dietary preference debate and issue.
Yeah.
So
I would
there's,
agree with that.
I tend to think of the whole dietary topic. I kind of put it into three different categories, and first one is like morality, the second is environmental impact, and the third is health and nutrition. And morality, it's I interviewed Peter Singer, and that was amazing, and he correctly pointed out that morality is in all of those, right? And I think the reason why I
True.
like to keep
True.
it, for example, environmental impact. If we know that it's going to negatively affect people's standard of living or even their health, um, in terms of what we're doing to the environment, therefore it becomes an issue of morality, right? If we're knowingly causing harm to people. I like to
Yeah.
keep morality separate though, because I think we're not all on the same page in terms of what morality even is. So I think it kind of deserves its own, its own little spot. But so yeah, the health and nutrition. I've read a lot of like Michael Pollan. He's written a lot about it. And I I think there was something really simplistic and easy about his advice. Basically when you get to the end of, it might be Omnivore's Dilemma. I've read a few of his books, so I might be mixing it up. But the dietary advice that he gives is eat real food, mostly plants, and not too much. So in the face of all these, different diets, you have a vegan diet, obviously, and then literally on the opposite side, you have a carnivore diet that's become popular. Everything in between, paleo, keto, whatever, there, and I think he coins it as nutritionism, right? And you can start thinking of it religiously, which I'm actually curious. If somebody that's a common claim. People say veganism is like a religion. What is your kind of take on that?
I think it's interesting. I feel for me, I feel like veganism is so I think I become quite critical of religious dogmatism. I think it's really dangerous, and part of the issue I think with religion is it has it relies on a group of people just kind of often just blindly accepting something. But more importantly, religion succeeds primarily because people are raised to believe that that's true and that's the way that we're ought to live. And I think within very religious states, whether those are countries or even just families, there's often a lack of dialogue that offers the opposing view. And I feel like within society, to not be vegan equates more closely to that of a religion, because it's just more of a blinding acceptance of something that we've always done and what we're raised to believe. And actually it's through questioning a lot of these teachings that we can then formulate our own opinions. And for me, being vegan or going vegan was actually an acceptance of how I actually felt rather than just living by what other people had told me. And I think it's interesting. I think it's kind of a smoke and mirrors situation where the opposite is more likely to be true, and it's through questioning our actions that you can really define how you feel. It's the same with a cult scenario. Veganism is a cult. It's like, actually, cults are people that just blindly accept, just follow leaders, just do what they're told, will not question the status quo. And so actually veganism is more of like breaking out of the cult of no longer partaking in, I guess, well, if we're going to be pedantic, animal sacrifice, but also just more of just thinking for yourself, which, and again, to play devil's advocate, you say, well, actually you're still accepting information other people give to you, and so there are biases on both sides regarding that. But for me, I believe it to be the opposite. But again, I'm going to say that, aren't I? Because that's how I feel. It's a difficult one. What do you think? Is veganism like a religion? Is it like a cult, or is it? And it's probably unfair of me to equate religions and cults. If you're religious and listening, I'm not saying you're in a cult. It's not fair for me to equate those two things necessarily.
Right. Well, let me put it to you this way. I was raised religious, right? I was raised Mormon. To the point where I even did a 2-year Mormon mission, where the black pants and the white shirt and the name tag and everything, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I have since, I no longer practice, and I consider myself an atheist today. And that's a whole that's a whole other podcast basically. But I find the story of Joseph Smith very interesting, and it actually maps on to nutritionism very well. Joseph Smith is the founder of the Mormon Church. Basically, like back in the 1820s, he was a 14-year-old boy, and he had a question, and the question was, what church is the right church? Which out of all these churches is correct? Because at the time, especially in that part of America, it was upstate New York. It was in a time of it had a lot of religious fervor going on, and there's a lot of different churches propping up all the time and causing a lot of confusion. And eventually he had, allegedly, emphasis on allegedly, he had an experience where he prayed to God, and basically God and Jesus appeared to him. He had a vision, and they said that none of these churches were the correct church, and that through him he would have to become like the next Moses, the next prophet, and they would have to restore the true church through him. And they like to emphasize the word restore. It's not a reformed church, it's a restored church, right? And so basically what Joseph Smith was able to do is find some kind of ultimate truth, the truth that kind of trumps all the other truth, right? And that's common in a lot of religions. So yeah, so I think all this maps on pretty well to what people call nutritionism, which is when you ask is veganism like a religion? Well, I think it can be. It's not necessarily it's how people work with it, and how they like some people are going back to religion. Some people are more evangelical. Some people are more quote unquote religious in how they try to get it out in the world, basically. So
Right.
I think it can be, but it's not. They're not vegans aren't the only ones. Is what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Do you mean more from like a nutrition point of view, or more as a philosophical teaching? Because I think if you apply it in terms of like a paleo carnivore scenario, then potentially so. But I guess what separates it from those other ones is, I think maybe the carnivore diet they might try and proclaim has some sort of philosophical grounding, although I think that could be disputed. But veganism, as opposed to like paleo or keto or something, is more than just like the dietary choice or what you consume. It's that more of that philosophical abstinence of unnecessary harm. Do you think that still applies in like the setting that we're discussing in a religious context?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm. I usually mention this at the top of my interviews. I mean, I am a truck driver, and like, all this, a lot of these topics and everything are very new to me. So
For sure.
So I don't want to say I'm not dumb or whatever, but.
Oh no, of course. But this is the beautiful thing about these, and this is what I've learned a lot from being vegan and questioning these things. Is there's so much to learn, and I think there's a real and this is another thing where I think veganism and religion somewhat dissects, is that religion is kind of the acceptance of knowing everything. I know the truth. I know the one God out of all the thousands. I know the one church which is right, and veganism is more of for me it's more of a journey of realizing that to be honest, there's so much I don't know. And when we look at philosophy and we look at these moral teachings, it's like, my God, anyone who claims to know the truth or have some absolute version of morality is either really arrogant or is simply deluded. And so there's what I love about these conversations is I don't believe that there's any kind of and I use this word because you used it, not because I think that it's appropriate, but the word stupid. There isn't that kind of like one person knows more. It's just I don't. No one knows everything about this, and to profess otherwise, I think is wrong. And I guess, to please, no worries at all. This is why I love these conversations. It gives me a chance to learn things that I had not. I mean, no one's asked me those questions about religion and veganism, and not seriously anyway. More in just like a passing, veganism is a cult. You're like ISIS or something, but not actually seriously.
I think
having a conversation
my
with me about
basic
them.
point was, I think I do look at different diets as almost like different religions. And it's not necessarily, like not every individual is like that, but in terms of maybe group behavior, I don't know. See, I also have a problem with maybe joining groups. I think groups can be problematic for those reasons, for just basic, I don't know, confirmation bias and feelings of like you gotta maybe toe a certain line and things like that. And actually, the idea of honesty, I think we need certainly a lot more honesty in terms of like just the idea of how much we outsource our thinking, so
Right.
especially for a lot of regular people and a layman such as myself. If I'm going to be honest, a lot of my my ideas and everything, they all kind of come from other people, like when I was getting out of my religion, obviously it was like Richard Dawkins and people like Sam Harris that were kind of helping me along the way, and I wasn't really figuring it out myself. And a lot of times it does feel like back in elementary or primary school where like kids would say, well, my big brother can beat up your big brother, like that kind of stuff. Right now it feels that way, where we have these people that we hold up, that we get a lot of our ideas from.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that's how, even if we look back through all the ages, everything that we kind of abide by now, and even from more objective, just educational perspective, something like maths, which is just absolute, and 2 + 2 = 4, and there's no variation on that's still learnt from others in the past, discovering these these scientific and mathematical discoveries, and even the way we think morally, it goes back to, my goodness, like the Greek philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. And so yes, there's everything that we feel and everything that we think and how we live today is influenced by all these people throughout the past and all these different teachings. And so I guess it does create an interesting situation where it's really hard to discover yourself in a world where there is a complete absence of yourself, so to speak, where every action everyone makes is influenced by others. I think it shows a connectivity, though, which I think is important. But you're right, that idea of like a group think scenario, I think it's like, was it George Orwell in 1984, like the idea of just adopting group think, group philosophy, group ways of life is very dangerous, and it has that risk of stamping out independent kind of critical thinking, I guess, like actually arguing with yourself, and I think that arguing with ourselves, like playing devil's advocate, trying to work out where we feel is very important to establishing what is more truthful about ourselves rather than what is put upon us by others, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, group think isn't a problem, if you have if that group has the right idea, right? If they're correct. But I think as humans, that's kind of rare to to be right about everything, right?
Yeah. Definitely.
Like if I were to ask you, hey man, are you right about everything all the time? Like, obviously you'd probably say no. Like, I'm not a douchebag.
You'd hope so.
And yet when it comes time to receive some kind of criticism, perhaps necessary criticism, we as people struggle with that a lot, and we get into these weird positions where we can't concede any ground or concede any points, and like you said, where's the middle, where's the gray,
and this relates back to what we were saying about lack of or disconnection. It's almost like to become connected with certain issues, especially let's use of course the animals example, to become become connected with those problems is almost like a form of criticism, isn't it? Like a criticizing the way you've lived, criticizing the way you think, criticizing the way you feel. What do you, I mean? I guess this is a tricky question. Is why do you think it is that we're so reluctant to criticize ourselves? I mean, we all feel it, don't we, when someone says something negative about us? I think for a lot of people, and I include myself in this, our first reaction is to get really tense about it, and rather than just to kind of say, oh, maybe there's some validity here, it's more like, how dare you say that? Leave me alone. I'm doing my thing. I guess, why is it that we're so reluctant to kind of reflect on actions?
I don't know. I think maybe there's more of an embarrassing answer, which is like we just don't want, we just don't want to be wrong. We don't, want to be questioned. And I think another answer is possibly, like almost in a lawyer kind of sense, how there's like these two ideas, like a defense and a prosecution, where your idea deserves to be like, you deserve to kind of stand up for your idea and fight for it. That's kind of another thing as well. Maybe it's kind of a mix of the two and more things. I don't know.
Probably so. And so if we take it back a little bit, and I hope this question isn't blunt, but is there still bacon in your freezer?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so, and why? And when we think about that process of what we're talking about, and that bacon you buy, presumably it comes from factory farms and slaughterhouses like Farmer John's.
It's most likely like me and my fiance, we have a Sam's Club membership, so which I don't know if that makes any sense in England, but it's it's owned by Walmart, and it's basically the enemy, so. But yeah, it's a matter of convenience for sure.
Convenience. So what do you think holds you back from not having bacon in the freezer? Or I mean, obviously I'm going to say vegan,
Yeah.
Maybe let's say that. What would hold you back from doing that? Or have you tried it and just it didn't?
Well,
then you went back?
I've had a lot of vegan food, and we have great vegan restaurants over here, and the food is great. Yeah, it is mostly if I'm being honest with myself, it is mostly a matter of convenience and taste and culture, all those things that you brought up, and it's embarrassingly hard, like difficult to overcome that.
Absolutely. It's not an easy thing to sometimes get over, but at the same time, it's also not insurmountable in the sense of we can do it. And so I guess the question is, do you think that those reasons on their own provide enough justification for you to have bacon in the freezer or any animal products?
No. I am wanting to move it in a different direction. And this is the place, where I've kind of come to is okay, here I am. I don't like factory farming. I want to get away from it. Therefore, what's the move? And like, do I go vegan? Do I hunt my own food? Do I go Joe Rogan style, and go hunt elk? And so we can get into like kind of the morality of hunting, because currently that is like kind of my current conviction is when I hear certain hunters talk about what they do, there's something certainly, I would say certainly better than factory farming. There's something almost like a return to nature kind of feeling, and they speak very romantically, about going out into the wilderness and hunting their own food and that thing. What are your thoughts on?
That's a good question. So I think environmentally, the argument, of course, has to is that hunting an animal, so in the numbers that we do now, hunting an animal is more environmentally sustainable than factory farming. The issue there, of course, is that that's because such a tiny amount of people hunt compared to buy meat in supermarkets. And so if that role was reversed, and all the the billions of people that, or at least the hundreds of millions of people that buy meat in supermarkets, if they then took up arms and went into the forest to kill animals, then environmentally that would be absolutely horrific as well, because it would be just destroying biodiversity. So the issue, I guess, environmentally is, of course, the demand, and so it's only so bad with factory farming compared to hunting because of the volume of it. But if that was reversed and only 5% or whatever bought from factory farms and 95% went out into the woods of Connecticut or whatever to hunt, then that's going to cause huge biodiversity and environmental problems. Different potentially, not with the greenhouse gases so much, but on a different level, still horrific. Ethically, it becomes a little bit more challenging, doesn't it? Because the argument often is, well, these animals are outside, they're not in cages, they live a life that is natural to them. Whether we'd classify it as a good life, I guess, depends whether you think nature's cruel, which I think it very much is so. But they live a natural life, and so becoming part of that process, so to speak, is more justifiable because, as you said before, they view it as returning to nature. Ironically, they're returning to nature with camo gear and high-powered rifles or crossbows, which is somewhat of a paradox in itself. But I think ethically, it still presents a huge amount of problems. But I think to be fair, I have to look at the arguments that hunters make, and a lot of those arguments are related to it's better than factory farming. Okay, potentially so in some regards. But also they say, well, it's about population control. And if we didn't hunt deer, I'm not sure if it's elk necessarily, but I hear it a lot with deer. If we didn't hunt deer, then the deer populations would overrun. They don't have enough food. It's more humane for these animals to be killed. And I think we have to kind of work out why this has happened. I mean, what are the structures in place that have led to a potential overpopulation of deer? And first and foremost, it's we've destroyed most natural predators, wolves, even cougars, mountain lions. We've decimated their population sizes. Many of them are extinct or on the point of extinction. Secondly, we've destroyed so much land to make way for animal agriculture. And ironically, the reason that these animals were hunted was to protect livestock animals. I mean, if farmers are having sheep killed by wolves, for instance, then that's not good for them. And so we have situations where, if you look in America, where sheep aren't indigenous animals, they've introduced a non-indigenous animal into an environment and then hunted loads of naturally occurring animals to save the lives of these non-indigenous ones that we then just kill anyway. And so if we were to, the way I see it is, if we were to eliminate animal agriculture and do a process called rewilding, which is let the land that we can allow just to regrow and repopulate, and with woods and forests or whatever that natural habitat may be, we provide more space for these animals that belong there. And we can also reintroduce natural predators. I know that's happened in some areas, and so that would be a better template than going out. And I feel like a lot of the arguments that are used by hunters are somewhat disingenuous, in the sense that they're trying to masquerade the fact that, again, they like the taste of meat. They enjoy the sport of hunting. It's also a cultural thing for many people. It's a traditional thing, and it reaffirms a lot of the time family bonds and family values. And so I still think that the reason it happens is those core principles. And a lot of the time, these other excuses are more like a facade to try and mask that. I'm not saying that hunters go out with this intention to kill and just for lust or just for blood money. I don't think morally it's any different than going to Walmart and buying a steak. It's the principle is still the same. It's just, the direct action is you pull the trigger rather than paying for someone else to drag the knife across the throat, so to speak. So morally, I don't believe it's any different, because it still comes down to the idea of necessity. And I don't believe that farming, small scale or factory or hunting, there is an absence of necessity there, and because there's no necessity, then the action itself is not justifiable, because it's still causing harm. And if you hunt a deer, you could have hunted a mother. there could be their babies left who are going to starve to death. Or vice versa, you could have killed a child and leave the parent mourning. So there are these issues that are unique to farming, because the loss can be more severe because it is a natural state for the animals to be in, rather than a natural action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think the
Okay.
whole idea of moral intuitions is fascinating. And yeah, just the
What do you mean by moral intuitions?
well, when the hunters are going out there and doing their thing, it's not, maybe not that they're masking these things, but yeah, they're running on a different philosophical software or something, right?
Yeah.
They kind of think differently about what they're doing, and they feel like it's good for the environment, and they're providing food and sustenance for the families and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And to them, it's very it's just it feels very natural.
Yeah, I think my problem is they don't go out, with this idea of like, oh, with a heavy heart, they don't. It's they I think. I don't want to generalize either, but I think for the vast majority of hunters, they do enjoy it. They go out with their friends, their family. Something to look forward to. They want to camp out. They feel like they're refinding nature, so to speak. And I think that happens with fishing as well, which is, it's a form of hunting in itself. It's people use it as a reason to be out in nature, and I think we often forget that we can be out in nature without having to have like that mindset of action. We can just exist within nature, and in that sense it's more harmonious. But so I think that sometimes the thought process of wanting to be out, wanting to experience forest, get out of the city, those are really great things to do. It's just then it becomes confused of I'm living symbiotically if I'm hunting fish or hunting land animals. And there is a different moral intuition is an interesting
Right. I think the idea we're kind
concept.
of dancing around is what is natural.
Potentially so, but what is not?
So
I've used this before.
Inevitably humans are going to, or even if we do all those things that you suggested, humans are going to interact with non-human animals somehow. And what
Yes, yeah.
and what is natural human behavior? And this to me is sort of the heart of the issue, and it's something I got really interested in. It is the appeal to nature, and what you would likely call the appeal to nature fallacy, right?
Right.
Basically, when you appeal to nature, so like if you find yourself where I'm at, you have some kind of secular morality, and you're still trying to justify your omnivorous diet. You'll likely try to appeal to nature, and you look out in nature, and it's a simple recognition that humans are animals, and we occupy a branch on the evolutionary tree of life.
Yeah.
Whereas people who are religious would say we are made in God's image, and therefore special, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which I don't believe in. So
No.
so yeah, it's a recognition that we are animals, and therefore humans are naturally omnivorous, and you look out in nature, and all we're doing is just fulfilling our natural diet, right? Which it becomes a fallacy because it only recognizes one driver of behavior, which is evolution. But it doesn't recognize the other driver, which is we are also moral agents. We have morality. And, and you are essentially cherry picking behaviors because you can look in the same nature and find behavior that we don't entertain. Very disturbing behaviors. We don't eat babies and we don't rape each other. We do, but it's highly wrong and taboo to do those sorts of things, right?
Right. You mean, and by babies, you mean babies of our own species as opposed to non-human babies?
Yes. Essentially, just things you find in nature that we find abhorrent and we ignore.
Absolutely.
So that's where it becomes a fallacy. But I think we can actually still use this and think about it even a little more deeply. So I'd like to use we can use the human sexual behavior. So in the human's sexual behavior, there's we seem to have preferences, maybe even you can call them discriminations. Where somebody might prefer a tall, things like height, maybe their income, maybe even their weight. These sorts of discriminations. Maybe you can call somebody shallow, but I'm not sure you could say they're like wrong or immoral, because we kind of recognize that there's an evolutionary kind of our sexual behavior is deeply rooted in evolution. At least I think it is.
Yeah, evolution. I guess social. I don't want to use the word social program, but social. What society deems universally to be judged. I think that's evolutionary. it's like fertility signs, like stuff. What would make a good mate from a primitive
what's
procreation point of
attracting,
view, right?
what's attracting to us, and
Yes,
that's guiding our sexual behavior and decisions. But also there is also the moral consideration driver of behavior in there as well. So if we let's imagine a woman who only discriminates on things like personality and like the content of someone's character, and that's it. She doesn't care about the height or the weight or the income. Many of us would look at her and say, "Wow, that's great. Good for you." And yet many of us would also not feel obligated to behave the same way. Right? So what seems to be happening is when you are accounting for these drivers of behavior, when you account for morality, I think a spectrum seems to open up. And it swings between, moral virtue and moral obligation, right?
Mm.
And so I think when you're talking and maybe trying to convince people of becoming vegan, to the way it's falling on their ears, it sounds to them like you're asking them, to behave just like the woman, to act more dietarily virtuous or something, and they don't feel obligated to behave the same way.
That's fascinating, actually. I'd never thought about that. So the idea of, we would say that in terms of sexual desire or preference in a mate, you would say that we would say that the woman who looks past issues of vanity and looks purely at the person's personality, that's the right thing. But we as individuals have our own preferences where we say, well, height is a factor for me, or general, or appearance is a factor for me, and we don't view ourselves as being wrong for that, but we still hold the person that ignores those attributes as in a higher regard. That is fascinating. So applied to our consumption of animals, we say, yes, objectively speaking, not harming animals would be the right thing. But in terms of my preferences, I feel like I am evolutionarily developed to feel differently. That's interesting. Is that kind of the is that a summary that would make sense?
Yeah, because I've heard the appeal to nature fallacy being used in a way that says that acknowledges, like, hey, hold on, not so fast. You need to think about how we're moral agents, and therefore we're obligated to be vegan. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think.
Well, okay, so let's to play devil advocate with, I think the consequences of those two comparisons, they're different in the sense of what's at stake.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what Peter Singer said too.
That's reassuring.
Yeah, it's a good criticism. The criticism I give to it is I think that a lot of our virtues have kind of like how when they do what is like radioactive dating or something, and like things have a half-life, and like how long something takes to turn into lead.
Yeah.
I think virtues kind of have that similar feature about them, where they have a certain amount of time where they just turn into obligations. And so.
That's interesting. I see. Okay. So you're saying like the virtue of not harming animals, over time we would perceive to become an obligation.
It could be, but the question, a lot of my ideas are very half baked or not even in the oven. But, what was I saying? Oh, so to me the question now is: do virtues always turn into obligations, or do some of them, fall by the wayside and become forgotten, and they're just a fad or something?
Wow,
I don't know.
I think that objective virtues, when the victim or what's at stake is has a direct negative impact on liberty, on freedom, on self-preservation, then I think that those virtues will stand the test of becoming obligations. But virtues of, I'm trying to think of a virtue that wouldn't fulfill that. I'm thinking, of course, animals, but I'm thinking racism, sexism, also maybe how we treat other humans in terms of garments. We'd say that a virtue we should buy secondhand, we should buy ethically made, and potentially over time that becomes more of an obligation. I'm trying to think of a. Do you have any examples of virtues that?
Nope, that's why it's
Do
half.
you have
That's why it's
examples?
half
Yeah,
baked. I just thought of
yeah,
it, so I don't know.
yeah. I think that true justifiable virtues will always have that obligatory element to it. Whether that means that people naturally, but accept that obligation, I guess is different. But I think that virtues that should be considered seriously will always have an obligation to be fulfilled. That's what I would say.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah.
good question.
Yeah, so it kind of gets into the idea of, basically paradigm shifts, right? And yeah, we can look at history, we can see. Now, actually, I want to get your take on this because a lot of people they do compare where this expanding moral circle and things, and they compare the animal rights movement to things like the civil rights and equal rights. And a lot of times it gets criticized. What's been your experience with that?
It's a good question. I guess there's two ways of looking at it. I think in kind of a very objective, bare bones, all of these different social justice issues we're fighting to create a more tolerant society for those that were victims, within those social justice issues. So I think in like a total like bare bones objective, like what were the main goals, and they're definitely comparable. I think where it becomes, I mean, I don't personally make those examples. I feel like it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we say, veganism is like the civil rights or the animal rights movement, more aptly put, is similar to the civil rights movement. It's like I feel like that alienates people as it's kind of it creates the sense that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy where and I do believe in the sense of the history will show that this was the right thing to do, and I'm not saying that it's not right in the same sense that the civil rights movement was right, but I think, as you say, it's about paradigm shift, and if we want to shift the paradigm, we have to understand what the current paradigm makes people think, and I think drawing up these comparisons between something that we would hope most people agree with, women's rights, civil rights. Even though I would agree that animal rights is just as important in many ways, most people in society don't believe that. And so trying to draw those comparisons is going to create tension and frustration. And so I think, all these different movements exist within their own right as well. And the need for comparisons, I don't think it's necessary, because we don't have to think about civil rights and women's rights to acknowledge that animals deserve the right to life. And all these things were campaigning for different things in terms of what those rights involved. I mean, the rights that people fought for people of color is very different to the rights that people fight for animals. We don't want animals to be considered citizens in the same way. I mean, citizens of the world and a right to life and freedom from human inflicted exploitation. Yes, but they're different in terms of their overall objectives, I guess, and when you look at the finer details of what the movements want. So I guess it's like the same with the Holocaust comparison. To be blunt, is the word Holocaust alludes to a systematic mass killing, and when we look at the objective definition, what happens to animals is an example of a Holocaust, right? So the animal Holocaust, but that exists very differently to other Holocausts that have existed during time, and I don't understand. For me, I think to compare horrible atrocities to humans to horrible atrocities to non-humans, I think is counterintuitive, and I don't think it holds much veracity, because the two things exist for different reasons. Yes, the systematic killing, yes, is the same, but the reasoning, the psychological thought processes, all these things were very different. And so when it's comparing movements or atrocities, I personally don't see the credibility to that. And there's a lot of people that are going to disagree with me on that one. In my advocacy, I never make them. I think it's too divisive. That's how I feel. It's just not necessary. What happens to animals and non-humans exists within its own right. And I think to try and compare it is people either think we're trying to denigrate the suffering of humans or elevate the suffering of animals. And for me, it's just a simple acknowledgement that all of these things are wrong and all of these things should be abolished. And it's not about which is worse or which happens more or any of these things. It's just, this is wrong. Let's just stop it or change it. Alter paradigms. That's where I sit on that argument.
Yeah, obviously there's got to be a way to compare these things without taking away from another thing. It seems very obvious to me. I don't know. Yeah.
So would you say that the comparisons between social justice movements and indeed human atrocities like the Jewish Holocaust, would you say that those comparisons are appropriate comparisons in your I guess as a non-vegan, do they offend you, or do you think that they create an easier version of easier way to empathize?
Yeah, I think if you're just being intellectually honest, yeah, you can look at it and just be like, oh yeah, I see that. That's I see no issue with that, with those comparisons. I don't know.
That's interesting, but again, we're intellectually dishonest, I guess, as a species, aren't we?
You're right. Yeah, and we become just irritated and outraged, unnecessarily, I would say.
This is one thing that annoys me actually, is that veganism is somehow grouped with like an emotional thing. Or you find killing animals upsetting and sad. I don't find it upsetting and sad. And it's like, emotions does of course play a factor in veganism, but it's bigger than that. It's just logical. In the same way that exploiting people because of the colour of their skin, I mean, emotionally, yes, it's sad, it's upsetting, but logically, it's just absurd. So, like, I think what annoys me is sometimes movements that seek to make the lives of others better get grouped as being emotional, snowflake philosophies, but actually, logically, they make sense, and I think that's. For me, I think we have to drive that point home more, just the logical, rational process, rather than saying to people, killing animals is sad and it makes me cry. It's like, yes, of course, but you don't have to have that reaction to logically understand that it's still wrong.
Right. And I just want to give you some props real quick, because I've seen a lot of your videos, and that is a core feature about you is you do stay very, cool, calm, and collected. That was and when I was first just kind of exploring all these ideas, there's obviously so many YouTubers and people talking about how they're vegan. Your videos certainly stood out as something I could actually like learn something from. So thank you for that.
Well, no, thank you very much for watching those. That's very kind of you to say. I'm happy to. I mean, this is the thing. There's people respond well to different things, don't they, in different forms of advocacy and conversation. And
Right.
so I'm happy to hear that responds well to you. I think, yeah, it's what I think is most natural. It's as I say, I saw Earthlings and I cried and I was very sad, and it pushed me to be vegan. But I think it was just more of watching it and thinking to myself, this is insane. Like, how do we even logically justify this? Even if I didn't find it sad and it didn't make me cry, just think, well, this is just madness, isn't it? We're destroying the planet, killing trillions of animals, and also jeopardizing the longevity of our own health and well-being. It just seems, logically,
and
ridiculous.
that's will continue to be my question is, how is it that I can watch Earthlings and not, so now I'm swapping you out from Joaquin Phoenix and putting you in there, comparing myself to you. Why am I not having the same, type of change in behavior and things like that? And I think many of us are probably asking the same thing. I mean, I don't think I'm the only one out here that's interacting with these sorts of ideas and things, and wondering like, dang, well, now I'm learning about this, and it's bothering me. Why can't I change? So that's a lot of what I want to talk about too, is that maybe help people feel like they're not the only ones, or
No.
Yeah.
There has to be some. I think that there must be some sort of social and psychological element to that. And I think if I think of myself, I think of, emotionally speaking, I often, I think I guess there are different psychological things between people, and so what am I trying to say? I guess if I want to be honest and give myself a little bit of psychotherapy, so to speak, it would be like, I think that I sometimes have a reluctance to feel emotion to certain things, in sense of, for me to cry does take quite a lot of a sensory overload, so to speak. And so perhaps that's why it's easy for me to just rationalize this argument, is because emotionally speaking, potentially I could be slightly emotionally repressed in ways. Maybe that's because of my gender, maybe that's because of the way I was raised, or there is so many variables.
Right.
And I think that probably plays into a part with why some people don't feel certain things when they see animal slaughter footage. Maybe it's, the part of the world they were raised in. Maybe it's how their family taught them. Maybe it's, Are they emotionally repressed? Do they wear their emotions on their sleeve? So as humans, we're so similar, but we're also so vastly unique, and we have all these little weird idiosyncratic behaviors and psychological flaws, and also psychological benefits as well, that we're always going to react differently to stimuli and to events and to footage. And so it then becomes the question of, how do we as a movement, and myself as an advocate, how do I encourage someone like yourself who doesn't see Earthlings and go vegan on the spot or whatever, to then have a connection that makes you push through those cultural, traditional taste, convenience barriers? I guess, and that requires some sort of self-reflection within veganism as a movement, to try and work out, how do we get this message across to people that, and I think for someone like yourself, it probably is that rational, logical, eventually I would hope, and maybe, who knows, you'll get to the point where you go, okay, enough is enough. Like, I've done this, I've allowed it to continue long enough, but I can't do it anymore. That's the last bacon in the freezer. Let's move on. And I don't know. I wish I could click my fingers, say the magic phrasing, and have you do that. But unfortunately, I guess that there is such a complicated situation that I think can be oversimplified. When we say, we categorize people: good person, bad person. Don't harm animals, good; harm animals, bad. But I wish it was as easy as that. It certainly isn't. Tricky business, isn't it?
Yeah, something I'm fascinated with is an Abraham Lincoln quote, and it's a really racist one. Are you familiar with this at all?
I don't know if I am. Give me
Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, we've sort of solidified him in this. He's the great emancipator, and he was so bothered by human enslavement that he started a war over it, right? And he has this quote, I think it was in a debate with Stephen Douglas, person from Chicago, I think. I don't know. But it was some kind of presidential debate. And he basically says, like, hold on, people. You guys have misunderstood me. I'm not saying black people are equal to white people, right? And he says a lot of things in that vein, basically, like, white people are always going to be superior and black people inferior, and all these very, to our ears in this paradigm, very, very bothersome, and that idea that idea, as we look into history and we see even somebody who is a part of change, who is heavily instrumental in that change, being somehow flawed and imperfect. This, as what I believe is, as we look back at this time, future generations will look back and we'll see that maybe the world will be a plant-based world in the future. It's plausible, if not even likely. They're going to look back, and I'm not comparing myself to Abraham Lincoln, but here I am. I feel like I'm a part of this change somehow, and I'm very, very imperfect. So I think we're going to see a lot of that in the future.
Agreed. I think on a broader point, I think history has a way of romanticizing figures that do good and eliminating their negative sides. I mean, I think there's even quotes from Gandhi, saying terrible things about black people. And, Gandhi, of course, not Gandhi, Right. And so history has a way of, or the present has a day of romanticizing figures from the past. But I guess in a sense I think that obviously what they say and those actions are horrible, but the positive from that is that understanding that actually there is no such thing as morally pure and morally evil, probably more morally evil than morally pure, but that there is this kind of idea that, society changes and we have an obligation to change. And so just because you are engaging in a bad behavior now doesn't mean that you won't engage in a behavior that's really positive and can change, and you as an individual, but also what you represent, won't be looked on in the future as being this beacon of a morally progressive mindset. I think that's important, and I think it's almost annoying that it is so, but it's almost liberating to understand that we are imperfect beings. But again, that imperfection does not give us a lack of accountability to do what's good. And I think for someone, or anyone that engages in behaviors that we recognize as being wrong, the acceptance of imperfection doesn't then negate that accountability that we have to change.
When I think of like people use the term maybe radical, or vegans are radical, PETA protesters and things like that. It reminds me of um, in American history, the Boston Tea Party, and what those guys did there. They got on the boat and threw a bunch of tea, over the boats and everything, and that's another thing that was solidified in a way where we're like, wow, that's like, those guys are badass, like that was great. But if you do a little bit of research, a lot of people at the time were very bothered by what those guys did, and a lot of the same terminology was used. These guys are radical, they're too much. I find that another thing that's interesting. Just imagining what future generations, how they're going to solidify what's happening, today, and it's quite possible that these radical, quote unquote radical vegan protesters are going to be solidified in a way that says like, wow, that was great. Without them, where would we be? So
and the Boston Tea Party, what were they protesting against or in favor of?
Well, I think it was England's their grip on their
okay, yeah, that make the classical tea. Okay, that makes sense then.
It was an economic thing, and
sure. Well, the word radical is so interesting. It gets thrown around as being negative. I mean, the only reason social justice movements exist is because what they represent is radical. If it wasn't radical, then there'd be no purpose in them existing. And it does. I've had this conversation with police officers before. It was at a recent climate march in London, actually, so not just vegan related, more environmentally related. And this police officer was threatening to arrest some like 12-year-old children. And I thought it was hilarious. And then I was just like, why do you think that's acceptable? And she said, well, I'm just doing my job. And I was like, hang on a second, like doing like this, you're a lady police officer. Police officers 200 years ago or 150 years ago doing their job would be arresting people campaigning for the rights that you accept so freely today. And if we'd gone back to 1900, do you think that a police officer saying I'm doing my job as they arrested a suffragette for campaigning for women's rights, would you accept that as just being okay? Of course not. That's outrageous. And so the idea of something being wrong just because it's radical is the same idea. I mean, it was radical to campaign for women's rights. It was radical to campaign for civil rights. But there were still morally righteous campaigns to have. And so often what is radical is what is necessary. But the problem is the word radical is somewhat used and correctly as well, for religious extremism or political extremism, far right terrorism or something like that. Radicalism is often perceived as being purely negative, but actually the word radical objectively can be both positive as well as negative. And it always strikes me strange. I've been called radical before, and sometimes I want to wear it as a badge of honor and go, well, of course I'm radical, because society is so messed up and so disgusting in relation to what we do to animals. To not be radical would be an act of immorality, like it's just... It's fascinating how we use terminology. The word extreme, doesn't have to be necessarily wrong, because if you take the Jain religion to its extreme, it's an incredibly peaceful religion. It's just when you take something that could be used negatively to the extreme, then it becomes bad. But to be extreme when what that code is good is a very positive thing. Like to be extremely happy, to be extremely positive, to be extremely caring, that's not a bad thing. But words are used in ways to try and connotate negativity when in fact that's not really fair, or is it logical, I guess.
Right.
Let's just take it right back to the truck stuff, and so you don't do that anymore. And I guess thinking back on the footage that you shot, are you happy that you filmed that? Are you happy with the direction that you went?
What do you mean by am I happy? Like
oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Are you glad that you did it? If you could go back in time,
certainly. And I'm still in a place where I'm still waiting for things to happen. So it's still there's still, I'm still waiting for that kind of hindsight, I guess.
True, because the footage hasn't been released yet.
I think the Joaquin Phoenix thing. I think he showed it, premiered it somewhere, kind of small,
okay,
but
great.
it's not like on Netflix or anything. So yeah,
No, but
yeah.
but I hear Shaun Monson is putting it into his latest film, isn't he? So, as far as I'm aware, I may be wrong, but I think when I spoke to Shaun last year, he sent me a lot of the footage, and he was saying that it was going to go into like his new project, the project he's working on. So I'm sure it will be seen by hopefully many people. But I guess it's in that moment when it's released, and then you'll have to work out whether or not. I'm personally very interested to see how what decisions you've come to into the future, and I for one would be very interested to have you back on the podcast at any point. But I also want to give a little shout out to the project that you're working on, and so would you like to just talk a little bit about what you've been doing recently? You've mentioned talking to Peter Singer, but you've spoken to a few different people, and would you maybe want to talk a little bit about what you're in the process of collating together?
Right. So from that experience, the Joaquin Phoenix and Shaun Monson, I was kind of left feeling like, there was more that I wanted to say, which is basically all these things that we've been talking about. I felt a little bit like a person called Walter Gaston, who I learned about from the Malcolm Gladwell podcast, Revisionist History, and basically he was a character. Not a character. He was a person, an African American person that was made famous in headlines during the civil rights movement. There was a picture of him. It was the policeman with the dog, and it looked like the policeman was releasing the dog to attack this young black child, and he was that young black child, Walter Gaston. And it turns out, you learn later that that's not what happened at all. He wasn't even a civil rights. He wasn't even like in the march or anything. He was just a bystander, and he was actually critical of the civil rights movement. And the police man, he was actually pulling the dog back, and the whole thing just kind of exploded and was misunderstood. And what I'm getting at is Walter Gaston was kind of inconvenient to that narrative, and that's how I felt with Shaun Monson and Joaquin Phoenix. I think they're great guys. Like, I like them. I talk to Shaun Monson all the time. Me and him talk about all these things, but still I had a feeling of just like not being understood, really. So I've decided to go on and make my own podcast and talk about basically what it's been like for me to try to answer this question of what do I do about not liking factory farming. The show is called, if you can forgive the frivolity of it, it's called Pig Shit. So, it's just really just shit about pigs. But if people don't like that, maybe they can find some solace in the subtitle, which is Navigating an Expanding Moral Circle. And hopefully that's, I'm still putting the show together, but hopefully by the time this is released, I can have something available for people to subscribe to, which is, the show will be called Pig Shit, and it will be on available on iTunes and probably wherever you get podcasts from. So
yeah, great. Wonderful. Okay, well, we've been speaking for like an hour and 40 minutes, which has just actually flown by. So for the sake of probably our listeners, we'll wrap it up there. But I would be interested to maybe if you think of more topics to discuss, I'd be very interested in continuing this conversation further, because I feel like we've touched upon some really interesting issues, but I guess the limits of time probably stop us from engaging in a lot of other conversations that I'm sure we could touch bases on. So I'm sure we'll talk again on the podcast, but until then, Matt, thank you again. And actually, it was really interesting what you were just saying then about almost being, I don't want to use the word used, but almost being put in a position where your position was used for the narrative. I think that's interesting, actually, and an interesting point to make. And so I'm glad that you've pursued this direction to discuss your feelings and to discuss your points of view, and also to engage in conversation with others who would disagree. I think that's admirable in itself as well, and something that we definitely need more of is just discussing issues that we disagree with people who disagree with us, and seeing how we can meet that ground. And anyway, I'm waffling on a little bit, so basically, thanks, Matt. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you too, man.
All right, cool. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and the different topics and routes that we've gone down. It was definitely, like I said at the beginning, I thought we'd engage in some really unique conversation, especially unique to the things I've discussed in this podcast before. So I hope you've enjoyed that. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you, or more importantly, you will listen to me next week if you'd like to. But until then, have a wonderful week. If you're vegan, then stay vegan. And if you're not, then I implore you to do a bit of research yourself, raise some awareness, and also self-reflect and maybe think about these ideas of culture and taste and tradition and things that Matt and I have discussed, and see where you fit into these moral dilemmas, and whether or not you can self-criticize and self-reflect in some of the ways that we've discussed today as well. But until then, have a great week, and we will speak very soon.